So, Mr. Bond, without objective moral absolutes, can you really call me evil? Hey there, everyone. It's your old pal Black Swan here, and I just wanted to talk a little bit today about morals, morality, and ethics. And the reason I want to do this is a very important topic and question to me. I was raised in a pretty typical Protestant denomination church from a fairly young age. It was nothing crazy or outlandish. It's something you'd recognize if you've ever been in a Protestant church before, singing at potlucks. There we are. And when you're raised in that kind of religious environment, I think this is probably true of most of the major Abrahamic faiths. Certainly is true of Protestantism and like Catholicism. You are taught that God is the existential moral foundation of all of reality. Like God's nature is morally perfect, and he grounds all of our moral questions and decisions and understandings. And when you lose your faith, you lose that moral foundation, and you can really feel unanchored and awash and tossed about and without something firm to hold on to. When you really begin to ask the question, without God, how do we ground our moral questions and decisions and assessments? And that's something I spent a lot of time wrestling with and trying to understand. Now, one of the mistakes I think that is frequently made by atheist philosophers and philosophers in general, and even theist philosophers, is absent God, leaping to nihilism, going immediately to there are no right and wrong, there is no good and evil, we can't make any moral assessments without having that existential foundation, that existential objective moral absolute to deal with. And I think that's honestly just a big mistake. It's an overreach. I know William Lane Craig tends to do this. He says if you're being honest with your atheism, you're compelled to become a nihilist. And I just think that's wrong. And honestly, a big part of that is because I don't think that foundation was ever real in the first place. And if there never really was a God to ground all of that on, then why, and we weren't nihilists back then, it was a fictional foundation that we had, then why do we need to leap to nihilism just because we've lost that fictive foundation? And there are plenty of cultures, maybe not plenty of cultures, but there are certainly cultures that exist without any real solid God beliefs that still take part in this moral exercise. So I think where we begin is by examining the question of what is morality. Morality is the exercise of making value judgments and assessments about the rightness and wrongness of our actions, especially in regard to other beings, especially in regard to other thinking beings, especially in regard to other sentient beings. But it is this exercise of making value judgments about actions, and without thinking agents, there is no morality. And because it's only value judgments about actions taken by thinking agents, and in particularly by sentient agents. We don't make moral evaluations about lions and dogs and insects when they do things that we would consider to be brutal or violent, or if a harmed human was to do them, would be immoral. So before you can even make an immoral assessment, there has to be a certain level of cognition involved and a sense of that this being making this action, taking this action, has a sense of awareness on that kind of level. I would actually contend that it goes even a little bit deeper than that. I think absent any other living agents or thinking agents, morality also becomes sort of an absurd exercise. If you do the thought experiment where you are completely alone in a spaceship, say, there's not another living entity around you anywhere. You will never see another living entity again as long as you live, in the idea of this thought experiment. Are there any moral evaluations to be made in that place? Can you be immoral with respect to your own self? And I'm not sure that you can in that case. This has a lot to do with context and whether or not there are other thinking agents. But certainly, absent any thinking agents, there are absolutely no moral evaluations to be made. So the question really is not why should we behave moral? Why should we care about ethics? But why do we? The should is about the should is really about ethics, not morals. Ethics being, the oughts. What should we do in a certain given situation? But morality itself is the question of, why do we even care about this? I think there's an explanation for that that's pretty straightforward. We are a social species, and cooperative behavior is a survival advantage for social species. So it makes sense that we evolved in a way that favors mutual cooperation. That's where moral and ethics come in. The more stable your society, the better reproductive success you have, and the more you're going to flourish. So those behaviors that promote that kind of stability are selected for. That seems like a very parsimonious explanation for why morals and morality exists. But that moves us on to the question of how do we make these moral assessments? How do we ground them? If there's no existential moral absolute, no moral lawgiver, how do we figure out what's moral and what's not? Now, one of the analogies that's been made, and I think it's a really apt one, by Matt Dillahunty, in fact, is the idea of comparing morality to health. What does it mean to be healthy? Does it just mean the absence of illness, or is there more to it than that? And you think about somebody that never comes out, never gets any sun, stays in his basement all day long, looks kind of thin and wasted. We would not say that person is healthy, even though he may not be diseased. It's still not healthy. So there's a grayness to this. It's not clear cut what we mean by healthy. In the same kind of way, what does it mean to be moral? And I don't think it's always that clear cut. It's not just the absence of doing something wrong. And the great analogy, again, for this, to move into another analogy, is the idea of having two children in a restaurant. They're both misbehaving. And you take them out of the restaurant, and the one child gets told if they misbehave in a restaurant again, they're going to get a beating. And the other child is explained to them that, they're misbehaving in the restaurant, disrupts other people that are trying to enjoy their meals, and they're given a sense of empathy and an understanding about how their actions impact other people. So you bring them both back into that situation again, and both children are now well behaved. Which one is more moral than the other? And I think we would generally agree that it is the person who is behaving out of a sense of empathy and compassion for other people, and not the one who's doing it out of fear of recriminations, out of fear of punishment. And I think it's fair to say, at least this is the place I'm at right now, that there is no physical act really that you can describe absent context that could be judged to be moral or immoral. It entirely resolves around the context of the situation. If you think about a simple physical act like touching another human being, is that a moral or an immoral act to do? Well, absent context, there's no way to make an assessment about that. Are they welcoming the touch? Do they not want you to touch it? Is it a gentle touch? Is it a hard touch? Is it a hard touch that they wanted you to do? Is it a gentle touch that they didn't want you to do? There's all kinds of context you need. Is it a stranger? Is it someone you know? Is it a socially acceptable form of touch? There's all kinds of things that you need to know before you can begin to make that assessment. So no moral assessment is made in a vacuum. And to take another step further, if you think about sexual intercourse, is that a moral or an immoral act? Well, absent context, we can't make any assessments. And of course, the biggest context one for that is consent. If there's not consent, it's immoral. It doesn't matter how else, whatever else is involved without consent. And I've had people, when I've tried to raise this issue, talk about, well, what about rape? But if you think about that word, that automatically implies consent in the definition of the word. It automatically it's a sexual contact without consent. So we now have that contextual component that lets us begin to make a moral assessment about the situation. So I think all morality is situationally assessed. Nothing is just exists in a vacuum. There is no inherent good thing in the universe to measure against. I know C.S. Lewis has that famous quote where he talks about how can you tell a crooked line if you don't have a straight line? Well, what if there are no truly straight lines in the universe? I mean, space is curved. If you take a pair of parallel lines and run them on long enough, eventually they're going to intersect with each other. I think it's an overly simplistic way to think about it. And who's to say that the straight line is the good one and the crooked one is the bad one? Certainly, if you're building a house, you want nice straight lines and square angles. But if you think about the fjords, we think they're beautiful because they have no straight lines. It's that curve, it's that randomness, the motion, the shapes that imparts a sense of beauty. Look, trees don't have straight lines, but we impart a sense of beauty into that. So there's no like clear always right, always wrong with this kind of thing where you can make simplistic comparisons like that and say you need straight lines and crooked lines to make assessments like that. These things just don't exist in a vacuum. And the other comparison I was thinking of when we talk about physics, motion in physics, everything in the universe is constantly in motion. But when you want to examine one specific thing, you use what's called an inertial frame of reference. You're throwing a ball to another person. You've got the two people, static ground, or they're static in relation to the ground, and then the ball moving back and forth between them. And that's your inertial reference frame. Now, that's not sitting still. The Earth is spinning. It's going around the sun. The sun is moving through the universe. Things are wobbling and shifting and moving everywhere. The space itself is expanding. So there is no fixed still thing to measure motion against. And I think there is no fixed still thing to measure morality against. You need your moral frame of reference to make that assessment about what is and what isn't moral. And there are no clear answers. Again, going back to the health. Is it healthy to eat peanut butter? Well, that depends on the context. For some people it is. For some people it isn't. Is it more healthy? If you've got a really severe peanut allergy, it could kill you. So obviously it's not healthy for someone like that to eat peanut butter. You know, maybe you're a little overweight, you're trying to lose weight. Peanut butter's got a lot of calories in it. So it's, not super healthy, but it's not necessarily unhealthy either for that person. So context and situations are very, very important for making these kinds of assessments. One of the ways that theists and apologists like to frame this is by pointing to extremes and calling those moral absolutes. Like the common one is like raping babies for fun. They point to that and say, see, that's everybody would agree that that is wrong, so that's a moral absolute. But what I think they're doing there is not pointing to an absolute, but pointing to an extreme and calling it absolute. And again, going back to the health analogy, you think about drinking battery acid. Everybody will agree that drinking battery acid is unhealthy. That's just obvious to everybody. Like to say that it's healthy just completely throws out what we mean by health in any way, shape, or form. So, but can you point to that and say that's like some abstract absolute about health, or is that just so far to the extreme it's obvious that it's unhealthy? And I think that's what people tend to point to when they say that there are moral absolutes. What they're doing is pointing out to moral extremes. But most of our lives are not lived on those extremes. They're lived in the gray stuff in the middle. Most of us will never confront these massively deep moral questions like, do you throw the lever and save your grandmother or save the 10 people from the runaway train? These are interesting thought experiments, but most of us will never deal with that kind of moral question in our lives. The moral questions we have are much smaller, much simpler. Do you put the cart back in the spot in the cart corral when you're done with your grocery shopping. That's a great one that's come up online recently. And I think it's a fun thought experiment about why you would or wouldn't put it away and how that impacts other people. And there's no law against it, it's not legislated. The only reason you have to do that is compassion towards other people. Some people do, some people don't. I mean, it's not a big deal if you don't. You're not the most horrible person in the world for not putting your shopping cart away. But those are the kind of small and interesting moral questions that we have to deal with on a day to day basis. And I think morals really is, at its core, at its heart, situational. But that brings us back to this place, sort of where I started. This feeling of being adrift without that existential moral foundation to rest on. And that's an uncomfortable feeling. It's frightening to think that anything could be argued in or argued out of as being a moral thing. But just because something's uncomfortable doesn't make it not true. There are a lot of truths about the world, about reality, that are really uncomfortable to deal with, inconvenient to deal with. But the point is, that doesn't make them not true. And we have to learn to accept that this is how morality is, and this is how we figure out, and this is an ongoing conversation, and this is always going to be an ongoing conversation. For as long as the human species or our progenitors exist, we are always going to be wrestling with these questions of what is moral, what is ethical, what are the boundaries? Do we include all thinking animals? Do we include animals that aren't thinking? How big do we make this tribe? How important is it to think about the morality of slaughtering animals for food? These are all kinds of interesting questions that we have to work through. And that struggle is a part of the human experience. And it's always been that way. If you think about modern Christians, especially, just disregard so much of what's in the Bible. Like, this is again the easiest go to. The Bible sanctions slavery. It just does. It just does. It tells you can own people as property and pass them on as an inheritance. And we recognize now that that is an immoral act. And yet Christians have disposed of things like that in their lives because they're not resting on a foundation that's in the Bible. They're resting on their own moral understandings and interpreting the Bible in that light. That's what we do. And it's an exercise in empathy, it's an exercise in understanding, and there are deep questions to be worked through here. And I think just cheaply foisting them off on God, saying, this is my understanding of what's in the Bible, so that's right and wrong, without giving it any more thought than that, does ourselves and our society and our fellow human beings a real disservice. And I think we can do better than that. And honestly, I think Will Wheaton said it best. Don't be a dick. Thank you so much for taking a few minutes to watch this video. Hopefully it wasn't too rambling and incoherent. If you liked it, thumbs up. If you don't like it, thumbs down. Do what feels right to you. I'm not going to judge your morality because of that either way. Peace out and be kind to one another.